but we will move on to some grounding slides for MSAC after we go over some notes for today's meeting. Please mute your device until you're speaking and do not present your screen. You will need some way to jot notes down during this meeting, but don't worry about taking them furiously because, again, this will be recorded and the slides will be posted. We'll hold the meeting to the established time with the opportunity for additional sharing digitally. There are a few breaks for questions, but we have a lot to get through today, so I may ask you to hold some of those for follow-up outside of this webinar. If you are new to Google Meet, here is an overview of the features and layout, with the most important ones being how to mute yourself with the microphone icon all the way to the left, turn your video on and off, or leave the meeting by hitting that red button that's a phone icon. So in the chat, which you can find all the way to the right in a little text bubble icon, I'd like you to drop in the chat who you are and what brings you here. Are you A, an artist offering programs to learners and you're currently on the Teaching Artist roster? Are you B, a school or site representative seeking funds to bring a program to learners? Or are you some other person here for some other reason? If so, feel free to share and we will touch base in a little while about who's here. Moving on to the grounding slides and philosophy for the Maryland State Arts Council, I'm going to read our equity and justice statement. The arts celebrate our state's diversity, connect our shared humanity, and transform individuals and communities. The Maryland State Arts Council, MSAC, and its supporting collaborators are committed to advancing and modeling equity, diversity, accessibility, and inclusion in all aspects of our organizations and across communities of our state. MSAC and its grantees are committed to embracing equity and non-discrimination regardless of race, religious creed, color, age, gender expression, sexual orientation, class, language, and/or ability. The vision of the Maryland State Arts Council is to play an essential role in ensuring every person has access to the transformative power of the arts. We advance the arts in our state by providing leadership that champions creative expression, diverse programming, equitable access, lifelong learning, and the arts as a celebrated contributor to the quality of life for all the people of Maryland. We have 5 strategic goals that came out of the strategic planning process in 2019. Those 5 goals are to increase participation, provide intentional support, build capacity, leverage connections, and bolster Maryland arts. Goals 1, 2, and 5 are most connected to our time here today, learning about the Arts and Education Grant. For folks that are just joining us, a reminder that this recording will be posted along with the slides, so you will be able to catch up on anything that you've missed, which is just our grounding statements. So our creative meeting actions, we ask that everyone celebrate being in the space with other creative people, engage with everyone's presence as a gift, acknowledge that together we know a lot, enter the conversation with curiosity and inquiry, share your idea and trust that it will be heard, use I statements, focus your language on the task at hand, hold one another accountable with care. Apply yes and. I hear your idea and I'm going to add to it. And to balance speaking and listening. The flow for today is to go over the grounding slides, which we can check off the list, get some background for arts and education at MSAC and specifically the Arts and Education Grant. There will be breaks for questions. which may be answered during the session, or there may be follow-up later, just so we can get through everything. An orientation to preparing to apply for the Arts and Education grant and how you should enter information into Smart Simple. Another break for questions, a review of the process and timeline, and then how to get in touch for more information. Again, for folks just joining us, this will be recorded and the slides will be posted. But it is time to hear a little bit of what was shared in the chat. We did a roll call trying to figure out who's here and what brings us all here to see if folks are A, an artist offering programs to learners and currently on the teaching artist roster, B, a school or site representative looking for funds to bring a program to learners, or some other options. So I'm going to look at the chat to see who we have here today. I see some B's, some C's. So happy if you are a C trying to figure out what arts and education is, how you can get involved with MSAC. This particular grant is focused mostly on folks who are on the roster. And if you are not on the roster but are interested, we have a webinar same time next week, so you can learn about that process as well. But it's still beneficial to get a sense of how the grant is structured so you know what you are eligible to apply for once you are on the roster if you decide to move forward with that. All right, so the Arts and Education program at MSAC has 3 branches or buckets. Poetry Out Loud, the National Poetry Recitation Competition for high schoolers, will not be discussed today, but it's a wonderful program that I hope you all look into and get involved with in this next year. We also have the Teaching Artist Roster, which is a curated directory of Maryland-based teaching artists who lead a variety of arts education programs. And the Arts and Education Grant is how we get funds to Maryland-based schools and sites for educational engagements led by those folks on the Teaching Artist Roster. The Arts and Education program went under a revision process that I'd like to give some context for in the fall of 2019 and the winter of 2020. Over 60 public constituents, teaching artists, representatives of Collaborators, and the Maryland State Department Education Fine Arts Office convened to serve as editors to re-envision the program as it had been running. There were 4 phases to this process to look at equitable funding in arts and education, the policies for the teaching artist roster, how the arts and education grant application is set up, and then aligning all of this with MSAC's internal procedures. And here's a photo of the lovely editors from phase 3. So if you are familiar with the Arts and Education program as it existed, say 5-7 years ago, then you are most familiar with the visiting performer roster and the artist in residence roster. But one of the takeaways from the revision process is that we now have the teaching artist roster, which covers visiting performances and residencies, but has also been expanded into a few other educational engagements that we'll go over momentarily. The next slide has more takeaways from that public editing process, which is including monthly reviews into the Arts and Education grant, which before had only been reviewed by staff members, not a panel of peers. We also introduced a match waiver. This is a way to request that the site's financial contribution to this project is less than 50% of the total cost. We'll get more into what a match is for folks that are not familiar, but please know that there's a match waiver now to address any inequities that a match might present. We also now have the equitable funding formula, which is a guideline to track the distribution of funds across Maryland counties. This applies only to school settings, not community sites, but this is not something that you as an applicant need to factor in to your process of applying. It's just noting that this is a takeaway from that public editing process. On the next slide, there are some flow charts and links to those flow charts in further detail. If you're visually just trying to figure out what does the roster have, what does the grant have, and what is the whole process and timeline, you can reference those flow charts. But we'll be going over the arts and education grant specifically today and the teaching artist roster next week, same time, different link. So the teaching artist roster features some of the lovely folks that you see here. Catherine Lyons at a visiting performance. We have a photo of an actor manipulating a puppet. We have adults working on a visual arts project. And we also have a teaching artist, dancer, Valerie Branch, with a raised hand working at an ECE residency through Young Audiences of Maryland. So this is just a way to orient you to some of the engagements that are offered that you could receive funds for as well. So the Arts and Education Grant and the Teaching Artist roster work together to accomplish the mission of the Arts and Education program at the Maryland State Arts Council. So roster teaching artists have experience with many communities and offer a variety of educational engagements. And this grant will fund up to $5,000 with a matching requirement. So MSAC and the school and site work together to make sure that a teaching artist is paid their fair wage. We'll get more into the details and breakdown of that payment, but it is an expectation that a school or a site also puts up money as well as the Maryland State Arts Council. Sometimes that can be a barrier, so match waivers are now available thanks to the public editing process. Schools and sites may be awarded up to 2 arts and education grants per fiscal year. So the photo that we have here is of Whitehall Elementary School students at a performance by a teaching artist, Barry Lewis Polisar. Barry could receive multiple grants within 1 year, but Whitehall Elementary School as a site could only receive 2. Perhaps they have Barry come in the fall and then again in the spring, or perhaps they have Barry come in the fall and then Valerie from the previous slide come in the spring. Whatever the arrangement is, Whitehall Elementary School can only receive 2 grants per year. You can apply for as many as you need until you hit that limit, but teaching artists are the ones who can be awarded multiple times within a year. So the Arts and Education Grant is a collaborative application between a current MSAC roster artist and a school or site to get funds to that roster artist in order to lead an educational engagement. All of the money will come from MSAC, but the school or site does owe some money. Again, we'll get into those details later, but just to give you that context now. So we are going to hop into another poll just to get a sense again of who's in the room here with us. Where do you work most often? Drop your letter in the chat. Do you mostly work in school settings during the day? Do you work in community settings and or outside of the school day? Is that when you are working? Or do you alternate between school and community sites? Because it can really depend on the day or the season what you're doing. Or is there some other option? And feel free to share that in the chat. But we'll touch base about those responses in a few moments. So the populations and communities that are served by the Arts and Education Grant include, but are certainly not limited to, early childhood audiences, so folks that are 0 to 3 years old, pre-K to 2 students, students in grades 3 through 5, middle schoolers, high schoolers, out of populations, veterans or folks in the military, folks who are older, 55 to 65 and older for creative aging populations, people experiencing incarceration or reentry, folks with disabilities, which includes people with cognitive, social, emotional, and or physical disabilities, friends from the LGBTQ plus community, people experiencing housing instability, English language learners, educators, and then whoever else you work with that's not captured in this list here. You're welcome to share. So the funds go to artist fees and stipends, field trip admission costs, consultant fees, honoraria, contractual services, transportation, and disposable art materials for engagements like field trips, lectures, out of school time programs, online programs, professional development opportunities with educators, residencies, visiting performances, or workshops. Moving on to give you an overview of the application questions that will go into depth in just a moment. There's an engagement narrative, the timeline, school or site support, your budget, match waiver if you are requesting one, and electronic signatures. These are the things that the application is going to ask for, but now we are going to hold some time for any questions that have come up so far, knowing that on deck is eligibility and the actual process of submitting an application and looking at those questions. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat or click the microphone icon to voice your question.
I have a question. So if I'm starting a nonprofit, then I'm probably not eligible for this because it looks like you have to have a site that is already set up to be a 501c3. Okay, just double checking.
That is correct. You do need to have one documented fiscal year in order to be an eligible site.
Thank you.
In the chat, we have a question from Ron Hennigan. How long does an in-school residency application take?
How long the application takes is completely up to the team that's working on the application, but it's reviewed monthly. And we'll get into the timeline in just a little bit, but it's a rolling basis. You can submit at any day, any time, what you would like to be reviewed by a panel, but the panel will only review it on a monthly timeline. All right, hearing no other questions for the moment, we can move on to talk about eligibility. In order for a site to co-apply with a teaching artist for an arts and education grant, they must be a 501c3 with tax exempt status from the IRS, and they must be incorporated in Maryland, or they can be a unit of government based in Maryland. Examples of that would be a public K-12 school, libraries, rec centers, prisons, etc. Or you can be an institution of higher learning in Maryland. You must have one completed and documented fiscal year at the time of application submission and have some ongoing arts activities. You must also demonstrate alignment with local health requirements and the governor's roadmap to recovery plan while we are in the midst of a global pandemic. So some advice before you apply. Read the guidelines on our website. We're going to go over a lot of the major points from the guidelines during this webinar, but there is some additional information that you should clarify by reading the guidelines, such as disposable materials, what educational engagements you can select, so on and so forth. You definitely want to confirm your primary site coordinator, and teaching artist. So only one roster teaching artist can be selected per application. We saw Barry Lewis Polisar for one of the photos earlier and Valerie Branch for another. The two of them could not work together at this current time on an application. So only one roster teaching artist can be selected. Your site coordinator must be an individual employed by the site. You may have a board member, a PTA member that is helping with this, but the contact information that is entered into the application for the site coordinator needs to be someone that has been hired by that site. And multiple sites can apply to collaborate in one application, but only one primary site and site coordinator should be identified. So if Barry was going to do a tour of several schools in Calvert County, up to 4, that is possible. But there still needs to be that one primary site and primary site coordinator that's listed in the application. Before you apply, you also want to discuss the teaching artist availability, the budget for this engagement, and what engagement you are working on. If a school would like some professional development for their educators, that's great. But the guidelines will let you know that if professional development is selected, there needs to be another educational engagement type selected as well. So maybe it's a visiting performance that happens and is then followed by a workshop for educators, or the order can be switched, however you want to set it up. But the guidelines will help clarify that for you. You also want to register for a Smart Simple account in order to collaboratively edit and submit that application. The teaching artist will start the application and then ask MSAC staff to link the site coordinator's account to the corresponding ID number. So did we talk about the last poll about where folks are working? I see higher education, some organizations, school settings. So a nice mix. But for this poll, please drop your letter in the chat to answer if you've applied for a grant before. Are you familiar with applying to MSAC grants and opportunities, but just not the arts and education grant? Are you familiar with applying to the AIE grant? Are you unfamiliar with applying to any grants anywhere? I love to see some C's, or is it D, some other experience that you have with grants. And I will briefly look at these now, but I will check back in on them later while we go through just a bit more information about the application itself. So, question 1, describe the program you are requesting funds for and how it will support your selected population or community's needs. An example of an excellent to outstanding answer for this question would clearly and specifically describe the community of learners that's being served, as well as their needs and desires. It would also provide a thoughtful overview of the learning experience, including how it's designed to serve and adapt the stated needs or desires of those learners. Question 2 is on here as well. It's very small because it's not a scored question. There are some questions that you'll be asked, but it's just not connected to the rubric. So question 2 is an example of that, and it's how will your program be delivered? Is that in person, virtually, or hybrid? Question 3 is asking, what is the timeline of activities? How does your planning and delivery account for learner safety and access in alignment with the school or site, local and state reopening guidelines? You should include dates even if they're tentative or estimates, and consider activities from planning the experience, whether that's a phone call or a site visit, to any follow-up activities like a reflection meeting after the engagement is completed. An excellent to outstanding answer for this response is going to demonstrate individual and collaborative planning with key stakeholders like teachers, administrators, principals, or executive directors. And it's going to speak to the final implementation, how this program is ultimately being delivered and delivered safely. Moving on to question 4, you're going to attach supplemental documents that demonstrate school or site-wide support for the engagement. These examples include, but aren't limited to, a letter of support, a recorded video, a draft of the contract with the school or site, any correspondence between the teaching artist or the site coordinator, or it can also be an electronic signature in the application from the principal or executive director. And there's a screenshot of this towards the end to give some context for that. Moving on to question 5, you're going to outline and provide context for all of your expenses and income by category and amount, such as the teaching artist fee, maybe that's $1,000, travel could be $217, disposable materials, $475. You'll include any anticipated income outside of the MSAC grant award. It's not required to have outside income, but if you do have a grant from another funder, you want to make sure that you're sharing that information as well, and that the financial information is clearly tied to the request for funding and indicates realistic expenses for its implementation. Now, the next few questions are also not scored, and it's just confirming what your total cash expenses are, because that's what's going to be used to determine your final grant amount, but that number should not include in-kind support costs. Question 7 speaks to that. Is the school or site offering any in-kind support, like teacher time, labor, disposable art supplies, etc.? If yes, please list what support will be provided and the associated costs. The total cost of these donations should be less than or at most 25% of the total cost of engagement. Question 8. Are you requesting a match waiver to reduce the site's financial contribution to less than 50% of the total engagement cost? If yes is selected, questions 9 through 10 will appear. If no is selected, then you're done. Those are all the questions that you have to answer. But we'll go over what 9 and 10 ask for folks that are going to submit a match waiver request. So question 9 is, how much can the school or site contribute towards the total engagement cost via a check to MSAC? It's important to note that if a match waiver is not approved, the school or site will still have to contribute funds equaling 50% of the total engagement costs. Question 10 asks you to describe the financial circumstances leading you to request a match waiver. If you do not receive the waiver but are awarded a grant, how would that affect your program? And an excellent to outstanding answer is going to identify a clear and substantial financial circumstance, as well as evidence that supports the match waiver that's requested in the application. So now we will have another break for questions before we actually look at how all of this appears in Smart Simple. All right, hearing no questions, we can move on to Smart Simple. The first thing that you're going to do is go to marylandarts.smartsimple.com and either log in or register if this is your first time with Smart Simple. The instructions on this slide and the next few slides are emailed to teaching artists for them to review with AIE grant collaborators when they first reach out to me to link someone to an application. So this information is available whenever you need it, but we will go over it right now. So before a site registers in Smart Simple, it's helpful to gather some information like the address, the EIN, and the DUNS number. So the EIN is an employee identification number. This is a 9-digit federal ID number that the IRS gives you. It's not a personal social security number. So when the site coordinator is registering, you should not be entering your personal SSN as a site coordinator. If you don't have your site's EIN, you should get in touch with someone at your site that does know that information. The DUNS number is something that you can look up at fedgov.dnb.com/webform to find the DUNS number for your specific site. If your site does not have a DUNS number, you could also use your county's public school DUNS number. If you have further questions about this, it's really geared towards teaching artists that should be helping prepare sites for this. That is something that you can be in touch with me offline about. Step 2 is to email me a request to add collaborators to the application. To add a collaborator, please always send the following information: the collaborator's full name, just so I don't get them confused with anybody else. Their email can also help in case folks have the same name. It happens. Also, the school or site's full name, not any abbreviations, just to make sure I'm looking at the proper Whitehall Elementary School in the correct county, and the application number, so I know that I'm connecting it to the right application, because teaching artists are likely to have multiple going at one time. If you are working on an application when the request is sent to me to add collaborators, the application might appear to be locked to me so that I can't make those edits. If that's the case, I'll email you asking you to log out just for a moment so I can make those updates. It doesn't take long if I'm actually on my email and not at a meeting or anything. And once those updates are completed, you'll receive notification that you're able to return to the application. So when you are logging in as a collaborator into Smart Simple, you will see a grantee home dashboard, and that will have your in-progress applications that you can access for collaborative editing. Again, if between the site coordinator and the teaching artist, someone is working on an application, it may appear locked to either one of you. If that's the case, you should email the other person asking them if they're in there, if they can log out for a moment while you make edits. Because if you reach out to me, which you can do to unlock the application, we run the risk of losing any recent edits if those haven't been saved by the other party. So this is a screenshot. Just for reference, I recommend logging into Smart Simple to see this more clearly, but this is an example of the electronic signature tab in the application where a site director or a principal could log in and add their name, and that could count for school or site-wide support for question 4 in the application. But on this slide, it's really just reinforcing that you should hit Save Draft whenever you can. and that instructions about all of this are shared with teaching artists. So the review process, we have monthly reviews for the Arts and Education grant. Those panel reviews are completed monthly this year from August 2021 to May 2022. It's a rolling deadline, so you can submit whenever you'd like, but by the 5th day of the month, anything that's been submitted will be added to the queue for the panel to review within that same month. If you submit something after 11:59 p.m. on the 5th day of the month, then it will be included in the following month's cycle. For notifications, selected teaching artists and their sites will be notified of their grant status by the end of the month in which it was reviewed. So if you submit by August 5th at 11:59 p.m., you will be notified on September 1st. But please note that notifications do not go out automatically at a set time. So if the 1st of the month happens to fall on a weekend, it might be slightly adjusted, but you will certainly be notified before the next month's deadline. The award process. After the monthly review and notifications are sent out, if you hear that you have not been selected to receive a grant, you may request a feedback appointment, and you can apply again at any time. If you hear that you received the grant, or maybe you don't because you don't respond after a month and 3 notifications, then that grant is going to be closed. For each arts and education grant a roster teaching artist is approved for, the Maryland State Arts Council will disperse directly to the teaching artist 2 payments. 50% is at the time of grant agreement form execution, and the remaining 50% is dispersed after a final report is submitted. So this connects to that match waiver portion and site match check that a site owes. The site will never directly send funds to a teaching artist, but the site does owe Maryland State Arts Council. So if you are a teaching artist, the payments that you are looking for will always come from the Maryland State Arts Council once after the GAF is executed, and then the last one after your final report is submitted. And for your reference, your final report is available as soon as your GAF is executed, and usually due around the end of the fiscal year, June 30th. A site match check is due to MSAC within 60 days of the educational engagement's completion date. Now we'll hold here again for any questions before we go into some final reminders and how you can get in touch with me. Well, hearing no questions, I'm curious for folks that have applied for an arts and education grant, if there's anything that's coming up for you right now during this presentation, knowing that this year is slightly different from last year, or any other questions. I just saw one in the chat. Are there ways that MSAC can assist in matching teaching artists with organizations? Yes. So there are a few ways that comes to mind immediately, and I'm just trying to think between what is built in more to applying to the roster and how it's set up for the grant specifically. But the first thing that comes to mind is the artist directory, which you don't have to be on the roster in order to have a profile on the artist directory. But this is a page where you can give context about all of the programming that you do. And because it's through MSAC, there are a lot of folks that are able to access your profile for reference by looking on the arts directory. Additional ways, we have professional development and networking opportunities. An example that comes to mind in December, we had for out of school time engagements, a networking session where service providers, so organizations that maybe it is a summer camp, a spring break camp, some type of after school program, any community programming that's considered out of school time, those providers were able to share what they offer and what they're looking for. And there were artists on our roster and not on our roster at that session that were able to share, this is my discipline, these are the engagements that I offer, this is where I'm based, I'm comfortable working in person or virtually. So everyone was in the room and able to share their information in a Padlet that was a way of sharing information that was available to everyone following that session, so folks could make connections on their own. And Chad has dropped some of those professional development listings in the chat. Thank you, Chad. Does the artist have to qualify for the directory? Anyone can have a profile on the artist directory. And if you are on the roster, we especially ask you to have a profile. But anyone, regardless of your roster status, can have a profile on the artist registry. Arts directory, I think we're shifting names internally and externally, but that place, you can have a profile there. Any other questions? Valerie? No need to raise your hand. Just go ahead.
So, Kat, it looks like the only difference that I can see.
I'm having a hard time hearing.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
Apparently my headphones didn't work this time. So it looks like the only difference that I can see between this upcoming year and last year's application is question number 4, where there's alternative ways for the school or the site to acknowledge that the partnership is a go. It seems like last year they just were required to do the electronic signature. Is that correct?
Yes. There are some wording updates, switching the order of things around. Last year, you were asked to upload a budget using a template that we provided, and this year you do not have to. The template is still on the website if you'd like to reference it, especially because there are some notes and things that can give you guidance in the template, but it's not a budget upload anymore. It's just a question with a text box, and you just call out the information there saying teaching artist fee, X dollars, disposable materials, X dollars. So the budget upload is no longer a requirement. And as you pointed out, there's the opportunity to upload documents that can speak to the collaboration between the school or site and the teaching artist.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, while I pause for questions, I will go through what was shared in the chat for some of those polls to just name who's in the room verbally, and then if folks want to talk about their work until we have a question, but I see that Rob has a hand raised. Feel free to unmute or drop your question or comment in the chat. You can unmute by selecting the microphone icon towards the left of center.
Okay, sorry, it didn't work.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to thank you, and I have to go to the website and have many questions that I don't think there's a time for sharing here. I use the website of Art Council
The
and find my.
sound just cut out for me a little bit. Could you repeat the last part?
Yes. Are you hearing?
Yes.
Okay. I was just telling you that I have many questions, but I prefer to go to website and and ask some questions maybe later. Thank you so much. I want to just thank you.
Yes, that's absolutely fine. And we'll get into contact information a little bit later, but I'll give you all a pro tip that it's not cheating to reach out to staff with questions before you submit an application. It's welcomed. I'd rather have a conversation with you before you submit the application rather than start going through the technical review and then have to say, hey, like, can you fix this in 24 to 48 hours in order to be included in this month's review cycle? So it's not cheating. I review applications on the technical side of things, but I am not a panelist, so I am not scoring them. So you can certainly bring any questions just about context for the program. But if you're also working on an application, I can't read your content and give you a thumbs up or thumbs down, but I can certainly give some guidance if you have any questions about the way things are set up.
Sure, thank you.
Any other questions? I see looking forward to next week's meeting. I am too. I love talking about the roster and giving context for how folks can get on the roster. I do remember seeing in the poll that some folks are perhaps even new to being a teaching artist. And so I definitely recommend that you check that out. All right. So before you apply, again, please read the guidelines, confirm your site coordinator and artist, discuss the artist's availability, budget, and educational engagements, register for Smart Simple, and if all else fails, contact MSAC for technical support or questions. I see Tama, teaching artist of the Mid-Atlantic, just dropped something in the chat, dropped their link. It's absolutely a great way to meet folks, find your way through work and the field. They have wonderful guidance on setting your rate along with the Teaching Artists Guild. They can help you if you're trying to figure out what rates to set as you start thinking through what your budget looks like. So what we have covered so far can also be found in those guidelines, which are on MSAC's website on the next slide, along with rubrics, specifically that budget template example. If you're curious, more information about matching waivers and the slides and presentations will be here. So
Kat,
what,
Stephanie Yoffe asks in the chat, is there a limit to how many are on the roster?
no, not that I have ever heard, or not that I would like to hear or have set, no. All right, so just as a recap of what we have covered in around 50 minutes here together today, the grounding slides just gave some context for MSAC's mission and goals. We learned a little bit about where arts and education at MSAC has been and has come to, specifics about the arts and education grant, time for further points of clarification, what to do in Smart Simple, what the timeline for this review process is, and then the next slide is how you can get in touch with me via email or how you can set up a meeting with me. And if you have any questions for Chad about the Traditions program at the Maryland State Arts Council, Chad's email is there as well, chad.buterbaugh@maryland.gov. My email is catherine.frost, that's CATHERINE.frost, FROST, @maryland.gov. And my Calendly is calendly.com/frost, FROST -AIE for arts and education. Thank you all so much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day all the way into your weekend.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Stephanie has a question. How do county level arts councils participate? The question that came up earlier about connecting folks with organizations, thank you for bringing that up, because county arts councils are probably a really great resource that I can certainly connect you with, and might have more details about organizations in their area, or teaching artists that need to be connected to organizations, or artists to organizations, organizations to artists, vice versa. And Chad has also dropped the Arts Development Program Director Abdul Ali, Abdul ABDUL.Ali, ALI @maryland.gov. Well, thank you all.